everyone, welcome back for our last class for this year. Before we begin with today's content, a few public service announcements, of course dealing with the exam. So, this is the last class and of course it's already online, and this concludes the materials for the exam. I will post today, if you're watching this on Friday, or beginning the next week at the latest, the list of subjects attributed to each and every one of you. I hope you have watched the videos and the slide with the instruction for the exam. If you haven't, please do so, because if you have any question about the exam, now is the time. I will send another message later about the very practical functioning of the exam itself. However, the general methodology is the one in the slides. Okay. You should also receive from the faculty a distribution, a time sheet with the times of your exams. As you will see, it will be a very long day of exams for me, so be patient if here and there I am maybe a little bit late for some of the times of the table. Thank you very much. Of course, you still are expected to send in questions for this last subject. However, I have not included homework for you to do, because the faculty asked us to stop on the 30th of April all our teaching activities. So I don't want you to work later than this week. So no homeworks this time. Yeah! Yes, I mean, it's the best. I mean, it was when we were in school. Now, less exciting probably. Anyway, so you will not have homework at the end of this, but still you can ask questions, and I will, if there are questions, provide a reaction video, or if there are more specific questions, I will try to answer them by email. Okay? Hope this is all clear. Because of that, today might be a little bit longer. I've tried to keep it to 1 hour max, but it might be a little bit longer because I will cover quite a lot of material today. It's still one topic, so don't worry. Okay, so if you have questions about the exam, please send them my way as soon as possible. Okay, now we can dive straight in for the topic of today, which is restructuring. A very appropriate topic to conclude a labor law class, because restructuring, you see, is one of these words which actually means something else. Restructuring in itself only summons to your mind something that is changing. Okay, you might restructure a course, changing the material, a house, or whatever. But in this context, restructuring very often means events which might lead to people being dismissed, okay, people losing their job. So restructuring is one of these nice ways in which company announce that something very bad is going to happen for workers. You have here a list of events that might fall in the concept of restructuring, and another good example of these bad things happening being called another way is like downsizing. Okay, when a company is downsizing, it means they're firing someone. Okay, so you have all these various events. Not all of them mean that the company will cease to exist. The company might just fire a lot of people, or maybe it will move to another place, or maybe it's being bought by another company, or in the worst case scenario, it is actually closing, or even worse, it's declaring bankruptcy, so there is no more money there. Okay. So all these various situations fall into the global concept of restructuring, which is not in itself a legal concept. There is no definition of what a restructuring is, but there are various situations which fall inside this definition. One thing that is important to keep in mind, some of the events covered under the umbrella of restructuring might also be relevant for other subjects of the other areas of the law, such as, in particular, company law. Okay, if you see bankruptcy or merging or splitting or transfer of undertaking might also have a meaning in company law, always remember that when you deal with employment law, definitions are proper to employment law. You cannot, in general, use a definition from another area of the law in the context of employment law. EU law, in particular, because today we will only be talking about EU law, deals with different areas of the impact of restructuring on social rights. Now, at national level, you might know from your knowledge of your national labor and social security law that there are various protections put in place for workers in this kind of situation. There are areas covered by labor law, in particular, maybe protection against dismissal or information and consultation of workers' representatives. And there are other areas covered by social security. Okay, so these workers which are laid off, dismissed, fired in the context of a collective dismissal might enjoy special protection under social security. The, let's say, fil rouge, the connecting line, the silver lining of all these situations is that, except for very specific and extreme circumstances, the decision of the employer, the power of the employer to decide on restructuring is not called into question. Okay, so the law might try maybe to make this decision longer, establish procedures. It might try to protect the workers which suffer the impact of this decision, but the law never goes so far as to say to an employer, no, you cannot fire these people. Okay, maybe you have to respect a procedure, or maybe you have to pay a lot of money, but it's very rare now in the EU that you find laws that go so far, unless, of course, the employer has breached procedures. That's another story. When it comes to EU law, this is even more true, and we will see in a second. Okay. So today we will cover 3 different areas, which each of them is covered by a directive. Very easy. You have the directives on eCampus. 3 areas: collective redundancies, insolvency, and transfer of a business, also called transfer of undertakings. So our first area is indeed collective redundancies. Then again, you might also hear them called collective layoffs, collective dismissal. This area was already regulated in the 70s. All the 3 areas actually were regulated in the 70s. Remember your history and what was happening in the 70s. So it was an economic crisis all across Europe. And the idea of having minimum standards for, in this case, dismiss workers in large numbers was that Europe, the European community, needed to have a level playing field all across different member states in order to avoid companies choosing in which country. Imagine you're a multinational company and you know that you have to close one factory and you have 3 or 4 spread across Europe. And then you consider where it is easier to do it. Where will it cost you less in terms of legal procedure, potential sanctions, and so on. So the idea was to avoid what is called law shopping, so choosing the most interesting country by multinational companies in their layoff decisions, and to create then a minimum protection for workers all across Europe. Here it is particularly true that the employer power to decide to dismiss a certain amount of people is not in itself called into question, but only submitted to procedures. The second important element is that EU law does not intervene in individual dismissal, so only on collective ones, and we will see in a second what it means a collective dismissal, when a series of individual dismissals might become a collective one. The first thing to keep in mind is that the concept of redundancy cannot be defined in a narrower way at national level than at community level. So the Court of Justice considers itself competent to decide if something falls into the definition of redundancy or not. Okay. And here you have an example of this in the decision Commission versus Portugal. The Court of Justice interpret the concept of redundancy to include more than just actually firing someone. You're fired. Instead, the Court of Justice considered all situations where there is a termination of an employment contract which is not decided by the worker himself or herself. This is a redundancy. Okay, so it doesn't mean that there should be necessarily a dismissal by the employer. Okay? Just that the contract will end without any decision by the worker. And this, of course, is a rather broader, but it is somewhat restricted by the Court of Justice in another decision, much more recent. So in this decision, the court said that other forms of termination of contracts should be included in the calculation to see if it is a collective dismissal or not, as long as there are at least 5 normal dismissals. Okay, so keep this in mind. It can be a little bit complicated, but it is not. So you need at least 5 redundancies for then go and see if there are other forms of termination of contracts which might be counted in the collective dismissal. So first you look if at least 5 people have been fired. And then you look if other people have had the contract terminated for a reason which is not their own decision. Imagine the end of a fixed term contract. Okay, pretty easy example. The contract ends, but the workers maybe did not want it to end. Okay. So these will be counted as long as there are at least 5 normal dismissals by the employer. Another example of what might fall into these other forms of termination, which might count if there are at least 5 normal dismissal, is the unilateral change by the employer of essential elements of the contract. So an employer cannot, for instance, unilaterally say, okay, from tomorrow you are you will not work anymore as a manager. You will work as secretary, cleaner, assistant, whatever. Okay, a lower function, let's say, and then wait for you to just quit. Okay, under the pressure of this change. So this unilateral change of essential element is considered by the Court of Justice as falling into the concept of redundancy, as long as, again, there are at least 5 normal redundancies. So all this is relevant because there are thresholds that tell you if a series of redundancies is indeed a collective redundancy under the directive or not. There are 2 methods for this calculation. One is in the table, so it depends on the size of the company. And the other one, you see at the end of the slide, means 20 redundancies over a period of 20 days. Okay. Of course, the 2 are not equivalent if you think about it for a second. In particular, the second one, consider it is flat 20 for each. Doesn't matter how big the company is, tends to favor bigger companies. Tends to favor smaller companies and than bigger ones. Okay, so if you see in the table between 20 and 99, you need only 10 for the method 1 to have a collective redundancy, whereas with the method 2 you would still need 20. Okay, so a smaller company up to 100 workers would have a, let's say, easier time trying to avoid the application of the collective redundancies directive. Okay, so 2 methods. If you are considering a national situation, you should check how the member state has transposed the directive, so they can choose either method 1 or method 2, but they have to pick one. Okay. So Once we have said this, the question is also to establish where they are fired. So should we calculate this amount of people being laid off, being fired, but considering the whole company in terms of legal person, or considering each specific establishment of the company? And the Court of Justice has opted for this second definition, okay? So of, let's say, establishment in a functional sense. You do not calculate on the basis of the legal person. And this, of course, in more recent times, has led, of course, to employers trying to game these systems. So in this case, you had a company, a legal person, quite a big employer all across the UK. And this employer fired a number of people in different establishments all across the country, more than 20. Okay, so the UK has opted for method 2. Okay, so 20 people over 20 days. And if you considered the legal person, this threshold was met. But these dismissals were spread all across different establishments, and the court said, yes, you should calculate on the basis of establishments, so you do not meet the threshold. Okay, so this definition by the Court of Justice makes it possible to spread layoffs over different establishments and try to not get to the threshold. The second point that we will deal with is the main protection which is awarded by the directive to workers. And the main protection is a procedure of information and consultation. That's it, okay? So this is the protection awarded by the directive directly to workers. Workers, or better, their representatives should be informed as soon as the employer, pay attention, as the employer considers the possibility to terminate the contracts of employment, okay? So when the employer is foreseeing the possibility of a collective dismissal, he or she or it, if it is a legal person, should immediately inform the workers' representative of this possibility, okay? And once they have been informed, start a process of consultation with the employees' representatives. The directive provides some guidance about this process of consultation, saying that the consultation should be aimed at reducing redundancies and at finding ways to make the social impact on workers less hard. However, as I have said, if the employer is adamant in its choice to fire these people, the directive does not give any tool to call this in question, any legal tool, of course. Because as you know, and little parenthesis here, as you know, or you should know, if you are aware of what happens reading newspapers and so on, every big, in particular large procedure of collective dismissal very quickly becomes also a political matter for a community, and also sees the involvement of public authorities at the table of negotiation. So there are many things that can happen in this sort of consultation, which might have the employer change its mind, okay? But from the legal point of view, you do not have an instrument to force them to not to fire these people. All right. So this is the main protection, the process of information and consultation. The question of when should this start? So I said it should start when the employer contemplates the possibility of collective redundancy, which of course is a very difficult thing to prove. So there has been a lot of litigation on this. And one important conclusion of the Court of Justice is that the employer cannot hide behind the fact that it does not have all the information yet before starting the consultation. So the consultation should start immediately as soon as these collective redundancies are foreseen. And then if other information become available afterwards, well, the employer can provide the information to the workers' representatives along the process. The directive also provides for no specific sanctions in its text. It only mandates member states to include these sort of sanctions. Okay, and if you see there, there is an and or. So these sort of sanctions, legal sanction, should be no, not should. A member state can decide whether these sanctions are available for individual workers who consider that this procedure has not been respected, or only to collective actors, so the representatives of the workers. And the Court of Justice has confirmed this by saying that indeed member states can forbid individuals to bring on claims against the employer for the lack of respect of the procedure if an action by the representatives of workers is available. So yes, a member state can say only the workers' representatives can go to court to attack for instance, the fact that the employer started too late the procedure of information and consultation, that the employer had already decided that these workers should be fired, so it started too late, the procedure. Okay, so this is everything for collective dismissals. So now we will go very shortly into insolvency. So insolvency, again, was regulated by a directive adopted at the end of the 70s by the European Economic Community and then reformed more recently. It covers a situation of bankruptcy in the broader sense, meaning situation where either the company is closed, okay, or where the company is insolvent, meaning the company is not paying its debts anymore, including its debts towards the workers. So the definition of insolvency, as you can see, it's broad and factual, and very factual. So based on a factual situation where payments have stopped to workers on a permanent basis. So it's not foreseeable that they will start again. What the directive asks member state to introduce is to introduce a sort of fund, national fund, which will cover the remuneration which is still to be paid to workers. So the directive wants workers to be protected by the bankruptcy of their employer, and that's it. Again, the Court of Justice considered that only EU law is competent to define the scope of application of the directive. So exceptions which are provided by the directive itself must be interpreted narrowly. This is not new. We have encountered this in many situations. Okay, I don't know why the title of the decision came out so late. Okay, you're late title. Anyway, so you have the reference. What is this protection? As I said, the main protection is that this national fund should guarantee the payment of outstanding claims for employees. So first, of course, the employees will be able to find the money by the company. Okay, so first it is the company that has to pay. But if there is no more money from the company, then this national fund can step in. This includes remuneration, which were not paid, but also severance payment for the dismissal of employees. Don't forget, of course, the responsibility of the state. By the way, the decision in Frankovic dealt with exactly this kind of situation. So if a country has not correctly transposed this directive, so a worker cannot see its outstanding claims for unpaid wages protected by the national fund, it can also attack the state. The second protection is that if the employer, suppose, has stopped paying social security contribution, it happens where a company is insolvent, the workers should not suffer any consequences for this. So, for instance, the unemployment insurance cannot tell a worker, oh no, you are not covered because your employer has not paid contributions. because the employer was insolvent. So this is second protection. The third is the protection of supplementary pensions. Imagine if a company has created a occupational pension at company level. The fact that the company becomes insolvent should not mean that the employees lose their pensions. So these are the main protections. The Court of Justice has interpreted it quite strictly. For instance, there were, I think this was an Italian case. So the country in question had provided a maximum for the amount paid by this fund, which is okay. However, the member state in question also provided that during the period of bankruptcy, because it is generally a period, a procedure, if the employer was still paying some remuneration to the workers, these amounts should count towards the ceiling. And this, of course, changes, okay, the very aim of the national fund. So the fund should cover money which is not paid by the employer. So the national fund, cannot say, oh, the employer has paid 5,000, so I will consider this up to this maximum that is protected. Okay. So again, generally, broad interpretation by the Court of Justice and protection of the aim of this directive. And this is it. So this is the main protection in case of insolvency established by EU law. With that, we go to our main course for today, which is transfer of business, also called transfer of undertaking. Again, the original directive is from the 70s, reformed in the beginning of the 2000s. Again, same reason for the creation of these minimum protection for workers in Europe was the internal market, which was making it easier and easier for companies to be bought and sold, sometimes across border. There were also different traditions concerning this subject. In French law, since before the Second World War, actually, the transfer of a undertaking, so a company or a part of a company, would also entail the transfer of all the employment contracts linked to that company. So if you buy a company from someone else, you also buy all the workers who are working there. Not buy in the strict sense, of course. They're still free people. But you have to take on all their employment contracts. Whereas in other countries, just like the UK, the employment contract was strictly linked to the person of the employer, so it was not transferred with the company. Okay, so you have this different tradition, and it was the French tradition which won in the sense of influencing the regulation at the European level. So the directive on transfer of undertakings establishes three main protections for workers in the context of the transfer of business or a part of business. Okay. So the first one is that employment contracts are transferred together with the business in which they are working. And this transfer also means that the contracts are transferred exactly as they are. So they maintain or they preserve all the rights and obligations and so on and so forth. Second protection is the prohibition of dismissal in connection with the transfer. So an employer cannot dismiss a worker and justify this because of the transfer. Oh, this has been transferred, so I need to fire people. Okay? This is forbidden. Of course, the employer remains free to fire people for other reasons. And the third protection is, of course, a process of information and consultation that has to start at both the transferor and the transferee company. So the transferor is the company which is selling, so the employer who's selling its company or part of the company. And the transferee is the one who is buying. Okay? So both of them at the company should start the process of information and consultation of their workforce. So the question here, of course, is one of definitions. There are many, and there is a huge case law on this directive. We will only see some of the decision, trying to focus on the important ones, of course. So, first of all, you have the concept of transfer of undertaking. What is a transfer of undertaking? And the second, of course, is also what is a legal transfer. So the question is partially dealt with in the directive itself. So the transfer means the transfer of an economic entity which retains its identity. Economic entity retains its identity. Yeah. And the entity must have the objective of pushing an economic activity. So all these different parts of the definition can be litigated, of course, and in some cases have been litigated. So first of all, what is an economic entity? What is an undertaking? And the Court of Justice here has a very broad definition. So it is just a grouping of persons and assets that exercise an economic activity, but they should also be sufficiently structured or independent. Okay, and independent, sorry. So a part of a company can be an undertaking in this sense, even though it has no legal personality in itself. Okay, so suppose a company outsources its cleaning activity. Okay, this is very classical. So a company, before, the cleaners were employees of the company, but then the company sells this part, so sells all the tools for the cleaning and so on and so forth to another company, which will do the cleaning at the company premises. Okay, so this is a transfer of undertakings. The exclusion from the directive concerns the public sector, but not the public sector in general, only the public sector in as much as the undertaking is concerned with the exercise of public powers. So the Court of Justice has confirmed that, for instance, the rearrangement of municipalities, let's say that you have, at a certain point, a state will redraw the borders of a municipality, and now from 2 municipalities you will have 1. Is this a transfer of undertakings? And the Court of Justice says no, because they exercise public powers. On the other hand, if you have a public body, so something governed by public law and financed by the state, which exerts economic activities, this would be covered by the directive. Okay? So if you're in the context of the private sector, no doubt the directive applies. If you find a case where a public sector is involved, you have to check whether there is an economic activity or the exercise of public authority functions. In the first case, yes, the Transfer of Undertakings Directive applies. In the second, not. So, for instance, in the Sanchez Hidalgo case, the Court of Justice considered that an activity of providing home help and surveillance, which was before carried out by a public body and then transferred to a different one, was indeed an economic activity and not the exercise of public authority, and as such, the directive would apply. Okay, so keep in mind this distinction if ever you find yourself to have to consult or provide advice to a client concerning the public sector. Second question is about transfer. So does legal transfer, the concept of legal transfer, concern only... Sorry. does the concept of legal transfer cover situations where there is no buying and selling of a company? Imagine the following situation. So there is someone who owns a small business. Imagine, I don't know, a normal high street shop. So this person does not want to keep on working in this shop, and he will rent the shop to someone else. Okay, and the shop has 1 or 2 workers. There is no selling. Okay, it's just a temporary contract for rent of the shop. But of course, there is a change in the employer. Okay, the new person who rents the company will be the new employer. And the Court of Justice has concluded that indeed all the situation which entail a change in the person of the employer fall under the definition of the directive. Okay, keep this in mind. This is your guiding light. This is your North Star to understand whether the situation is a transfer or not. Does the person of the employer change? Okay, and here you can see the difference between employment law and company law. Okay, in terms of employment law, what it matters is that there is a new employer, someone else. So this might have consequences for the workers, and we, as a community, want them to be protected from these consequences. Okay. This also includes a situation of so-called triangular relationship. So suppose you have the company A, okay, which operates under the model of a franchising system. Let's say McDonald's. Okay, the company of McDonald's will give a specific McDonald's restaurant, if you can call it a restaurant, so a specific McDonald's restaurant to someone. Okay, so this person will rent the McDonald's restaurant from the company McDonald's. At a certain point, suppose McDonald's is not happy with the results of this person, they will terminate the franchising agreement with them and then find someone else to manage this. Okay, so the question is, so you had employer person B and then the employer person C. At no point McDonald's will be itself again the employer. So McDonald's will take it from B and give it to C. Okay. Is this a transfer of undertaking, considering there is no legal relationship between B and C, and in the directive you have legal transfer? Okay. And the Court of Justice said yes, also in this case. Why? Because the employer has changed. So it's a transfer. So this broad interpretation of situations covered by the directive goes on. You have always, in general, I have taken just a broader definition, a broader statement by the Court of Justice. You can see if there is a change in the legal or natural person of the employer, you have a transfer of undertaking. Okay, and the court also explains why. The court considered that the situation is equivalent for the employees. It doesn't matter if a company is sold or bought or rented, the situation for the employees is the same. New employer. Okay. As I said, triangular relationships are covered. Does not need to be a direct contractual relationship, but it must retain its identity. So this is important. So if our example, the McDonald's, rent from employer B, rent from employer C, they do exactly the same thing. So the economic purpose is maintained the same. If these change, then you might fall outside the definition of the directive. The directive also applies in situation of outsourcing. I have already given you the more classical example of outsourcing, so cleaning. Once upon a time, companies tended to be what is called vertically integrated. So all the activities taking place at the company were managed by the company itself. So the cleaners would be employed by the company, the catering staff at the company canteen would be employed by the company, and so on and so on. At a certain point in history, this model has fallen out of fashion. So companies tend to now outsource all the peripheral activities like cleaning and catering to other companies. So at a certain point in time, the company A will say, okay, this all this part of the company, the canteen, the restaurant inside the company, we will rent it to another company, company B, and you will just manage the catering and food and so on for our employees. And the Court of Justice says, yes, this is a transfer. So the important thing, all the workers which worked at the canteen before will be transferred to the new employer, to the transferee, and even more important sometimes, they will also retain all their working conditions, which might have been different for the new employer. Okay, the new employer must take them as a package, let's say. The Court of Justice went particularly far in this interpretation, concluding sometimes that even the transfer of a single worker might entail a transfer of undertaking. So there is no threshold here, the important thing. It's different from the collective dismissal. So even the transfer of an activity with one employee, imagine our shop, little shop, clothes shop, with one employee, it's still a transfer of undertakings. The Court of Justice has also extended this to transfer between the public sector and the private sector. Okay, this is often quite complicated. So if you have, let's say, something that before was managed by the public authority, and then it is transferred, sold to a private one. Okay, a privatization. The directive still applies. So the new employer, although it is an employer in the private sector, must still take these workers and apply the same condition which were applied in the public sector. Sometimes this generates quite a lot of difficulties, but still, it is a very important, of course, protection for the rights of workers, which otherwise could see a very drastic change when moving from the public to the private sector. Something that is a little bit more complicated to include in this directive is the situation of mergers. So mergers is when two companies will be fused together. There is no definition. You can find a definition in the context of company law, but of course this is not applicable to our directive. So we only work with the our North Star, our guiding principle of the change in the person of the employer. And this can be particularly complicated in mergers, because imagine that the situation where a company is bought by another one, but this is a listed company, meaning it has shares which are traded. So company A is publicly traded on the market, and company B will buy the shares. Okay, so at a certain point they will have a controlling majority of shares. So de facto, this company has been bought by the new one, by company A has been bought by company B. But in legal terms, company A is still the same company. Okay, there is no change in the person of the employer. And this is a weak spot of the directive, weakness of the directive, because of course, a situation where a company is bought by another one might entail all the kind of changes which are generally linked with a change of employer, because the new company might have a completely different policy, different ideas about the future of the company, and so on and so forth. But here, the workers have no guarantee of the preservation of their rights, protection against dismissal, in correlation with transfer, and so on. Okay? So again, your North Star, is there a change of the person of the employer or not? So the next question is, of course, whether the business retains its identity in the transfer. I have already mentioned this. Is the business still the same business at the end of the transfer procedure? So this is another question. If you can prove that no, the business does not retain its identity, then no transfer of undertaking. Okay. So, determining the identity of a business becomes a question of paramount importance for the application of this directive. However, determining the identity of a business is sometimes a very difficult activity. Because of this, the case law of the Court of Justice is particularly complicated, And it has tried to create a long series of different criteria to do this. So here in Spijkers, you have a series of elements. I will not go through all of that. A series of elements used by the code to consider whether the the business, the undertaking has been transferred, retaining its identity or not. Okay. Where the intangible assets transferred, where the tangible assets, warehouses, tools, instruments, tables, whatever, where the workers transferred or are the customers similar, and so on and so forth. Okay. And the code says no single element is definitive. All of them must be considered in a holistic, let's say, assessment. So the Court of Justice has also expanded this to cover the workforce, working methods, for instance, and so on. So it is very difficult, of course, because companies are very different one from the other. There are companies where the main asset is the workforce. Okay, suppose a company consulting business. Okay, a consulting business essentially depends on the skills of its consultants. So if you sell the office in itself, doesn't change much, or the computers. So they have a customer portfolio and some workers, supposedly high skill, let's say. Most of them are, probably. Who knows? Anyways, so if they transfer these two things, then yes, it's a transfer. If they transfer the tables and computers and the office itself, maybe not. So it's always a very difficult assessment. Because of this, the Court of Justice has tried more and more to provide more guidance. But this ends up, if it provides more clarity, at the same time, it also provides more weaknesses. So the Court of Justice at a certain point has started to divide companies between asset-based and non-asset-based. So asset-based companies are based on their assets. So if the assets are transferred, it is more likely that we have a transfer of undertakings. Whereas a non-asset-based company, it will have more likely a transfer of undertakings if the workforce is transferred. So is the activity of the company based more on its assets or on its workers? Again, once you have invented a new dichotomy, you find all the middle cases. So in the case you see in the slide, it's Finnish case, I suppose, from the name, so I will not try to pronounce it. So in this case, it was a bus company, okay, company providing bus transport for persons, which was transferred. And the question was, is this asset-based or not? Is it more important to have drivers or buses? And of course, both are very important, but the court decided that no, this was asset-based. So the fact that you did not sell the buses means it is not a transfer of undertaking. No protection at all. Another example was a company for this company. I think it was a company which managed transfer of luggages. Let me check. And we are back. So the company in question managed intermodal transport, so transport of goods, okay, to make it easy. So the company itself had rented, so there was company A and company B. So company A operated this transport and other activities, and at a certain point it transferred certain part of the transport of goods to company B. But company B operated this service by renting the equipment, trucks and so on and so forth from company A. So when the company A stopped this outsourcing, this contracting out of its freight activities, it argued that it was not transfer because the ownership of the assets had always remained at company A. Those were only rented. But the Court of Justice said, no, this was not relevant because, again, the main part is the change in the employer, whether or not this is asset-based. So the Court of Justice also provided similar guidance in the context of a transfer between this was plane company, so flight company, and again the situation was similar. So the company had outsourced a certain part of its business to another air transport company. And this second company was operating the business by renting the actual airplanes from company A. And then at a certain point, it was brought back inside in company A, the activity, and the fact that there was no transfer of ownership of these flights was not considered as relevant by the Court of Justice, right? So this asset-based, non-asset-based provide some guidance, of course, that you have to keep in mind when advising your future clients or considering a situation. But it's, of course, a little bit complicated to apply in practice. So always look first at the change of the person of the employer, and then, of course, try to argue for the more favorable situation. Of course, if there was a transfer of assets and you want to prove that this was not transfer of undertakings, then of course you will argue that the company is non-asset based and vice versa. So the main protection, as I told you, is the transfer of rights and obligation to the transferee. So the contracts are transferred together with the undertaking and they do not change. So suppose someone has a seniority of 10 years in company A. When this is sold to company B, the person should be awarded the same exact seniority. So the same salary and so on and so forth. So the Court of Justice has had a very strict interpretation of what this means. For instance, in the Rask case, the court said that even a change in the date where the wage are paid, so suppose they were paid at the 30th of each month and now they will be paid at the 25th of each month, it's not acceptable, even if there is no change in the wage being paid. Okay, so a quite strict interpretation, very literal. So the rights and obligations should remain the same. Copy paste. The second element of this protection is, however, much more complicated, and it deals with the continuing respect of collective agreements for the transferee. So sometimes this is very easy. I will give you immediately the easy example. So you have company A, which is a company producing cars. The very, very boring example. So a company producing cars is sold and bought by another company producing cars. So of course they still belong to the same sector of activity. So if you have a collective bargaining system based on sectors, suppose you have the collective agreement for the automobile industry, no problem, the same collective agreement applies. This is easy, not a big change. Of course, this also covers company agreements, and this might be complicated. However, as you see there, the collective agreements applicable at company A should continue to be applicable at company B as long as they are not expired or they are not replaced by another collective agreement. So suppose you have a company agreement at company A, so company level agreement. When company B buys company A, company B must keep on applying the company agreement of company A. However, what they can do is to negotiate a new company agreement now that they have bought this other company, and the new agreement will cancel the old one. Okay? So this is relatively easy. When it becomes more difficult, of course, is when this new collective agreement, which replaces the old one, changes the rights and obligation of workers. So the Court of Justice says that overall, the new collective agreement should provide conditions which are not less favorable to workers. And here you can see it's much less strict than the interpretation of the first paragraph, so the transfer of rights and obligation. This was the interpretation of the first part was copy-paste. You cannot change anything. Here, you just have to provide a treatment which is overall not less favorable. Okay, so a global assessment of the difference between the two collective agreements. The very difficult situation which the Court of Justice has struggled with comes from what are called dynamic clauses or reference clauses. It works like this. You have a collective agreement in company A, which has been transferred, which says working condition at this company should be covered by the same condition as those of the sectoral agreement of metalworking. Okay, so this does not come from the fact that the company is under the metalworking collective agreement. It is a reference to a different collective agreement. Okay, so the question is, once this company A is transferred to company B, can the employer change this clause, which refer to a different collective agreement yet? Because the problem is, if the employer has to keep it, so it cannot change it, the working condition will continue to be established by a different collective agreement that the employer cannot negotiate. Okay, so it can be complicated. So the Court of Justice considered that this was a problem, and it did so the first time in the case in Verhoef, okay? Or maybe it was a Dutch decision, so in Verhoef. So a decision in Verhoef, the Court of Justice said, this is problematic. However, it said so for a very strange reason. If you remember a lesson on collective bargaining, and you should, of course, I have told you that there was this case, Gustafsson versus Sweden, where the European Court of Human Rights, different court, had said that forcing an employer to sign a collective agreement was not a violation of the right of the freedom of association. Okay? Forcing an employer to join an employer association is a violation of the freedom of association. Signing a collective agreement which has only economic consequence, it is not. Now, in Verhoef, the Court of Justice completely misinterpreted the decision of the European Court of Human Rights in Gustafsson and considered, you can see it, it quotes, it refers to this decision, that the fact that this employer at company B was forced by the transfer of undertaking to apply a collective agreement which he could not, or she or it could not negotiate, was a violation of the right not to join an association, of its freedom of association. So this was a misinterpretation completely of the case law of the Court of Human Rights. Actually, the very contrary thing that the Court of Human Rights had said. Whatever. So this was the conclusion of the Court of Justice in Verhoef. No dynamic clauses are not compatible with the directive. The Court of Justice corrected a little bit. It's aimed in Alemo Herren. Unfortunately, the conclusion is not much better. So in Alemo Herren, the court said that this kind of dynamic clauses, referring to collective agreements which are not under the control of the employer, so to speak, so referring to collective agreements where the employer will not be able to negotiate even in the future, are not compatible with the transfer of undertakings directive. I know that these dynamic clauses are quite complicated, so if anything is not clear, please send me an email, so I will have the occasion to speak a little bit more about this. So in Alemo Heron, the code said said that this was not compatible with the directive because although these dynamic clause offered a better protection for employees, and pay attention, protecting employees is the aim of the directive, the fact that the employer would be forced to apply a collective agreement which he, she, it could not negotiate was a violation of the very essence of his, her, its freedom to conduct a business. Now, freedom to conduct a business is protected by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. And the code you can see here, I have kept this last paragraph because you can see clearly the code correcting itself. The referring code, so the national code had said the right to join an association is not an issue here, like telling the Court of Justice, what are you saying? But the Court of Justice says this is not a problem of freedom of association, it's a problem of the freedom to conduct a business. So the Court of Justice interprets a directive which has as its aim to protect employees, but interprets it in light of the freedom to conduct a business of the employer. Because of this reason, this case has raised quite a lot of concerns, because ultimately all labor law has an impact on the freedom to conduct a business. It limits what an employer can do or cannot do. So if you now can interpret all protections in light of the freedom to conduct a business, you essentially have a new test, which is invented by the Court of Justice for all labor law protections. And we have seen together in our class on the freedom of religion, protection against discrimination based on religion, how the freedom to conduct a business has then been used in other cases dealing with the protection of workers. So there's a lot of concerns surrounding this decision. In other decisions, which I've not included because they are not that relevant for the moment, the court has used less. So again, the claimant, the employer, tried to argue on the basis of freedom to conduct a business in order to reduce protections for employees, and the Court of Justice has dismissed this argument. So we might be seeing a little bit of, again, a correction from the Court of Justice. However, Alemo Heron is still there. So keep this in mind. Keep this in mind in terms as a risk for the rights of your client if you are advising a worker, or as an opportunity for your client if you're advising an employer. All right. Okay, so this was my last slide, and also so the end of our classes. Of course, we will all meet, although digitally, for the exam. But as you maybe have seen already, if you have already received the schedule, or as you will see when the schedule comes, it will be quite an organized day, and the timing will be very strict. This is because there is 18 of you, and I will try to do all of you in a day. So I will be sitting in front of this webcam for around 12 hours. It will be fun, like, these marathon streams of YouTuber, which I can assure you I kind of feel like like a YouTuber this year because of this class. Anyway, so maybe I will do a reaction video next week. So this is not my last video, maybe it is, doesn't matter. Since the exam is never the best moment to say goodbye, I will just say thank you for your attention. I know that this year class has taken place in quite extraordinary circumstances, so I can only hope that with all these videos and reactions and so on, I have managed to keep you interested in the topic, and for maybe some time to distract you from the present situation. Although, of course, European international labor law might not be the best way to distract oneself. Netflix is surely much better. Try it. In any case, I have personally missed classes in person a lot. And if it is the same for you, well, I am sorry. I'm sorry for that. It was, of course, beyond my control. I've missed you all, and I've missed the possibility to interact directly with you, which is much funnier, of course, than sitting here doing videos. However, I have tried to do my best to provide with decent content for you to listen to and to watch and to read. So please, now it only remains for you to study for the exam, to be prepared. If you study, everything will be all right, and you will not need to see if in August we will still be stuck at home or able to do exams in person or whatever. Okay, so the last favor I'm asking of you is to study for the exam, so that we can say goodbye after May, and I can wish you the best of luck for your future. For the moment, thank you very much for your attention. Once again, stay safe, and bye.